Great Britain's history is full of success, prosperity, and dominance. It was one of the world's greatest powers for many years. As the old saying goes, the sun never sets on the British Empire. The British ruled lands all across the earth. They were very powerful, and a lot of their power stemmed from greed. You can see in these visuals. This is Africa during the late 19th century, and the lands that the British ruled are pink, which accounts for about 50% of Africa. This is Asia during the late 19th century, and the countries that the British ruled are red, and that makes up about 40%. Though the British have an essentially successful track record, not everything they've accomplished was positive, such as the British imperialism of Africa and Asia in the late 19th century. Many people argue about whether it was beneficial or detrimental. Imperialism may have seemed like a good idea to the British at the time, but in hindsight, it's obvious that the detriments outweighed the benefits. Although Great Britain's imperialism of Asia and Africa was a profitable action for themselves, it caused major drawbacks to the Native Americans of the late 19th century. The first reason the British came into Africa and Asia, the first reason it was detrimental to the continents was that the British came into Africa and Asia with disregard to the feelings and views of the natives. Their goal was to not preserve the cultures of the locals, but to transform them. Great Britain's arrogance is a primary motive of their desire to imperialize Africa and Asia. The British had the intention of helping the countries less fortunate than they. In the poem A White Man's Burden, Rudyard Kipling exclaims, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, bind your sons to exile, serve your captives' need." The British's disdain is evident throughout this passage. Racism is also a conspicuous motive of the British. It's quite obvious that they view anyone who is not a white man as inferior to them. The Africans and Asians are not capable of being a civil people, so they must step in and guide them in the right direction. They truly thought they were helping the natives, bestowing their wonderful knowledge upon them, not realizing the harm that they were simultaneously committing. The second reason it was detrimental is that the British were also very ignorant and disrespectful coming into the foreign lands, especially in Africa. They disrupted the Africans' way of life, taking over their land, which to the Africans it couldn't be bought or traded. Their land was sacred to them. It not only belonged to the people residing on it at the time, but their ancestors and to the kids to come. This was not the only disruption the British made to them. The native Africans already had local established government, but the British interrupted it and appointed new British rulers among the tribes. Although the natives already had a peaceful way of ruling their people, the British completely changed it. And the coming of the Pink Cheeks, African chief Kabanga explains, "What magic had the son of my father made that he who was not yet an elder should be made leader over us all who are so much older and wiser in the ways of our people?" This change of power left the natives confused and devastated, wondering why their world as they knew it was coming to an end. The third reason the imperialism wasn't beneficial was that Great Britain promised many things to the Africans and Asian countries under their control that caused disunity and distrust among the people groups. They promised them that they would be able to hold high political positions under the new British-controlled governments. This would give them sort of a ownership in their governments and in their homelands. Instead, they were forced and oppressed to follow the rules and regulations set in place by the British government on their own land. Another large problem that arose was that of rising taxes falling on the shoulders of the already financially failing countries. In India, for example, what was happening is that the taxes were being raised on the local people, but the British government was not providing the means to pay them. That's from the article The Benefits of British Rule, 1871. This showed the way the British government was not worried about the countries they were imperializing, rather than they were concerned with what they were acquiring. The fourth reason that it was detrimental was that Great Britain's greed and ignorance also played a significant role in the damage of African and Asian countries by the British. The British had no intentions of preserving the natives' land. Instead, they took it for all it was worth, stripping their homeland of its natural resources. This led to severe famine and drought in many countries. Though this was a major reason many Africans and Asians died in the late 19th century, it was not the only one. even though the British thought that what they were doing was good by taking the resources from the lands, they didn't understand the way that their land worked and their climates. So it took a hard hit on the countries because of famine. Another reason for the death of many natives was that they forced the natives to fight in wars that were not theirs. The British forced the men in their imperialized countries to fight their battles since they were supposedly part of Britain. Despite what the British said, the lives of the Africans and Asians were not a priority to the British because they weren't actually white. They just needed bodies to fight, so they took advantage of the natives. This reflects some of the British people's racism. Despite the obvious detriments of the late 19th century imperialism, many scholars still argue that it ultimately benefited the people of Africa and Asia. They argue that without Great Britain's interruption, countries in Africa and Asia wouldn't be industrialized, medically advanced, or educated like they are today. Granted, this may be true, but at what cost did they gain these things? The British stripped the natives of everything they had ever known and changed their way of life. They were forced to conform to the ways of people that they had no desire to be like or be ruled by. The things Africa and Asia gained for imperialism are little compared to what they lost. Great Britain's imperialism greatly affected the countries of Asia and Africa in a negative way. Britain's little regard for the land and people themselves of Africa and Asia is one of the reasons for the political unrest seen in the following years of the African and Asian countries. It led to an anti-British sentiment among the oppressed people groups. The British government was more worried about the acquisition of land and wealth than the people groups and cultures they were destroying in the process. All in all, opposed to popular belief, the imperialism in the 18th and 19th century by the British has far greater negative impacts than positive impacts.
I can't go any further.